Are you still single? A lonely life is pretty miserable." Those were the words thrown at me by my ex-husband who left me and our eldest son 10 years ago. The man who once betrayed us by having an affair with our son's ex-wife and left still looked down on us, smirking and appearing triumphant the whole time. I just waited, silently, letting my ex-husband ramble on. All I could do was bow my head and tremble my shoulders as he gleefully talked about how happy he is now and how pitiful he finds us. Maybe he thought I was crying, but I wasn't. I had to do that, or I would have burst out laughing. Seeing my ex-husband's behavior, someone tapped his shoulder. He turned around, and upon seeing that person, his face went pale and he looked at me. "Eh? What do you mean? Eh? Didn't I tell you?" My ex-husband, looking utterly confused, alternated his gaze between us. I decided to fill him in on what had happened in the last 10 years. "I'm Susan. I'm turning 56 this year. I thought we were just a normal, lively family with our eldest son and his wife to save money. That belief started to crumble about 10 years ago, just 2 years after we moved in. We didn't have a daughter, so I thought it was natural for my then-husband to dote on Nancy, our daughter-in-law. He would take her out for meals and seemed concerned about her. Thinking it was his way of caring, as she might have had a hard time with her in-laws, I started to worry a few months before the incident. Nancy and my husband had been going out together frequently. At first, I thought it was because our son was busy with work, but it became too frequent, going out 2 or 3 times a week. I gently reprimanded him. "Please moderate how much you take Nancy out. What's wrong with doting on my daughter-in-law? I'm just saying you should also let your son spend time with his wife." "All right, I'll be careful," he agreed, albeit grudgingly. But then, his business trips and Nancy's travels, suspiciously, began to coincide. Nancy claimed she was traveling with friends, but she rarely went anywhere with our son. Even on a day when our son had taken leave to ask her out, "I've got something urgent," she would leave alone. My son couldn't hide his shock, and my husband tried to console him. But soon, he would leave too. "I've got an urgent matter." Naturally, I went out. Business trips are frequent these days. Yes, work's gotten busier. Nancy goes on trips too, often at the same time as your trips. "What's that got to do with anything? I'm working." His evasive responses made me suspicious. Eventually, our son took a day off and followed them. He saw them cozying up in restaurants and women's boutiques. Though I had my suspicions, I never imagined my husband was having an affair with my son's wife. "No way," I muttered. "Are you sure it's not a mistake? Maybe you confused them with someone else." It was Dad's car number plate. I saw them go into a shop, arms linked. My son was devastated. I suggested we talk to them, though I was in shock myself. I couldn't believe that my husband would see his son's wife that way. I convinced myself that talking would help, though I had no idea what to say. I just waited for them to return. They came back that night as if nothing was wrong. We just happened to meet at the station, so we came back together. We called the two of them to the living room for a talk, but it was hardly what you could call a discussion. "Why were you out so late with Nancy?" "Sorry, I'll make sure to let you know next time." "That's not the point. Why do you need to go out so often, just the two of you?" I said I'm sorry. I just can't help but adore my daughter, you understand? My husband kept insisting. "It's just normal family affection, and I'm just fond of her like she's my own daughter." Things like that. He stubbornly maintained that he was just being overly affectionate toward her, even when it came to spending time alone with her, excluding our eldest son, and even about being seen with their arms linked. "Nancy, what about you? Why do you go out so much with Dad?" "Well, Henry seemed busy with work." "Dad's working too. You'd never try to go out with me." I'm sorry, Tom has the money and he takes me to lots of places. I got too comfortable with him, like he was my real dad, Nancy said, gazing intently at my husband, treating him like her real father. Their attitude, constantly making excuses and offering only superficial apologies, showed no signs of remorse. In fact, they seemed defiant. As if to say, our inability to accept them, trusting each other like a real father and daughter, made us small-minded troublemakers. Are we done here? We're tired. You should be nicer to Tom, wife. Yeah, tell her, Nancy. Then maybe you should be nicer to your husband, our son. I might consider it if he becomes successful like Tom. They were dismissive of our feelings throughout, not showing any signs of understanding. We had no choice but to propose a new discussion for the next day and retire to our bedrooms. The incident happened the next day. What is this? The next morning, I found a letter and a filled-out divorce application on the living room table. Written in my husband's familiar handwriting, the lengthy letter was filled with inconceivable things. I struggled to believe that it was written by him. I've been attracted to Nancy since my son brought her home. Since he's no good, I thought I should make her happy. I'd rather choose a young girl over a middle-aged woman like you. The nonsensical message was hard to comprehend. I felt dizzy trying to understand the letter. Finally, it read, "Don't interfere with two people in love. Just quietly get a divorce." I was at a loss. The second letter was from Nancy. It derided how pathetic our eldest son was, even mocking our saving efforts as stingy. Nancy's letter, clearly after money, preferring my husband, who spent freely over our frugal eldest son, left me speechless. Younger me is better than Susan. Tom said so. Please let him go. It even contained a passage looking down on her husband's mother. I never imagined Nancy, always well-dressed, was targeting Tom. A chilling thought. Our eldest son, hearing this later, looked just as pale and shocked as I did, shaking and unable to speak, retreating to his room. I tried to contact my husband numerous times afterward, to no avail. He seemed to have taken his savings with him, leaving me with no recourse but to cry myself to sleep. Haunted by the treatment from my husband and Nancy, my family and I lived on. Our turning point came 10 years later, at a certain steakhouse. I had some business and found myself at a high-end steakhouse that day. I planned to have a late lunch there. While relaxing in the calm atmosphere of the restaurant, I heard a voice I could never forget from behind me. Turning around, I saw my ex-husband, who had once eloped with Nancy. He was in a somewhat shabby suit, speaking loudly with the owner, his voice echoing through the restaurant. I thought about confronting him, but before I could, he noticed me and approached. "What are you doing here?" Seeing me sitting alone at a table, he smirked and took a seat opposite me. After scrutinizing my clothes and noticing the lack of ring on my left hand, he started talking with a triumphant look. "You not filing the divorce papers right away made things difficult for us. I'm sorry about that. Well, a middle-aged woman like you won't get married again." My ex-husband kept talking, showing off the ring on his finger, and bragging about how happy he had been with Nancy, even though I hadn't asked. He exaggeratedly pitied the miserable lives he assumed my son and I were living. "You're still single? A lonely life is miserable." I remained silent, looking down the entire time. I felt like I might burst into laughter otherwise. But my ex, misunderstanding my silence, said something absurd. "Well, if you beg, I might consider getting back with you." "What?" "When you do, serve me sincerely, I'll make you a caretaker for me and Nancy. Be grateful that I'm willing to take in a middle-aged woman like you." Talk in your sleep. His nonsensical remarks hadn't changed, and I couldn't help but respond. He seemed shocked, thinking I would be grateful and apologize. Seeing his foolish expression, someone tapped his shoulder from behind. "What do you want with my wife?" "Eh? The owner." "Wife? What do you mean?" "Didn't I tell you?" I took the hand of the steakhouse owner, who had walked up beside me. My ex-husband, confused, looked back and forth between the owner and me. I decided to tell him about the past 10 years. After the incident, my son was utterly disheartened. Worried about his listless state, his boss took him to a steakhouse one day. There, he became friendly with a woman. She had also been abandoned by her husband and found solace in their shared experiences, gradually bringing my son back to life. After many meetings and conversations, my son thought she and I would get along, so he brought me here. That's how I hit it off with the owner here. He's been very kind to me. What? You weren't stalling with the divorce papers because you were still hung up on me? Not at all. I just didn't want to do things your way. I was astounded at his self-serving interpretation. Correcting his misunderstanding, I told him why I was about to laugh earlier. You were calling us miserable, but aren't you truly the miserable one? What do you mean? I know. You've been constantly complaining to the owner here about Nancy. Hearing this, my ex-husband's face turned pale. Yes, I had heard about the talks my frequent visitor ex-husband had with the owner complaining about Nancy. The owner was outraged by his unreasonable stories. At the same time, he realized that those stories were about me and discreetly told me, "Your current wife is young and reckless with money, isn't she? Yet you can still afford to come to this steakhouse. You're just pretending, aren't you? It doesn't suit you." Realizing he had been sharing embarrassing stories with someone who knew everything, my ex-husband's face turned from pale to red as he looked down. But I felt no sympathy for him now. This man could still throw words like lonely and miserable at me, whom he believes he made unhappy. Remembering the hurt look on my son's face back then, I glared at my ex-husband. "What about the ring? You're not wearing one." "I have it. I just took it off because it gets in the way of work." Saying so, I pulled out a ring from my bag and slipped it onto my left ring finger. The owner, also unable to wear his ring during work, had purposefully put on our matching rings and come to the restaurant. Seeing this, my ex-husband seemed to shrink, his shoulders hunched. "I was wrong. I just want to talk to you one more time." Talk with someone who still looks down on me as lonely and miserable? What will we talk about? "Please, I was wrong. Forgive me." "Then bring some compensation for the divorce first. We can talk after that." Knowing how much he had complained to the owner, I was well aware of my ex-husband's financial troubles, but that was not our doing. He acted as he pleased and now faced the consequences. I had no reason to involve myself in his troubles. I decided to confront him with reality. "Don't bother us any longer today. It's an important day. I don't want anything to do with you ever again." "Huh? Why is it important?" I hadn't come to the steakhouse today to beat down my ex-husband I unexpectedly encountered. I had important business. Ignoring my puzzled ex-husband, I turned toward the sound of the door opening. "Mom, sorry. Did I keep you waiting? I apologize for being late. Work held me up." "It's okay, don't worry." I smiled and greeted the two who appeared. It was my son, neatly dressed in a suit, and the kind, beautiful woman he had become close to. Much more gentle than Nancy, to whom my ex-husband was visibly shocked. Noticing his father, my son was startled, but stood protectively in front of her. My ex-husband, disregarding their attitude, began to act arrogantly towards my son. "Found yourself a fine woman? Like father, like son. Who might you be?" "What? Talking to your own father like that?" "My dad is only this owner here." My son, now resolute, confronted my ex-husband. Unhappy with his attitude, my ex-husband tried to assert his paternal rights, but no one here was on his side. Everyone looked at him coldly as my son spoke further. "I don't know a man who elopes with his son's wife." I was wrong. I'll give Nancy back to you." Give back? A woman who chose her husband's father over her husband and made herself unhappy? Don't say that. We were a family. Let's start over. That's impossible. You said you had to make her happy because your son was no good. Do as you please and never involve us again. My son echoed the words my ex-husband had once written in a letter back to him. My ex-husband, flustered and trying to save face, couldn't erase the events of 10 years ago. Fed up with his persistent behavior, I delivered the final blow. Today is the day we meet her parents. Could you please leave us alone? At my cold words, his face turned bright red, and he seemed unable to say anything more. Having no place left, he finally turned towards the exit, just as Nancy appeared. "Why are you here eating steak alone? I want some too." Nancy, whom I hadn't seen in a long time, had changed even more than my ex-husband. It seemed he had spoiled her considerably. Her once youthful skin, marred by her diet, looked older than her actual age. The Nancy who once looked down on me as a woman was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, she had been searching for my ex-husband, hoping to get money from him, and barged in. Noticing us only after causing a scene and being reprimanded by the owner, Nancy approached the woman beside my son with a rude attitude. "Huh? What? The next wife? Despite not filing divorce and still being hung up on him? There's no lingering affection for a wife who chooses dad over me. Such a plain woman suits you. Thank you. I'll be happy on your behalf." Despite Nancy's abusive words, the woman responded without taking offense, leaving Nancy wide-eyed and screaming even louder. But as I had told my ex-husband, Nancy, who couldn't see reality, had no chance of winning. My ex-husband looked uncomfortably embarrassed. "You'll never be happy. You should just live miserably." "Enough, Nancy. Let's go home." "Why? Kick them out. I haven't even eaten steak yet. It's not fair." Nancy, throwing a tantrum like a spoiled child, was dragged away by my ex-husband. After the stormy event, we exchanged knowing smiles. "Shall we start over? Are you hungry?" "I'm fine. My parents will be here soon." "Then, darling, please prepare the most delicious steak today." "Leave it to me." The rest of the day went smoothly and we had a peaceful time. Seeing my son's happy face made me content. The steak that day, cooked with care by my husband, tasted better than ever. From now on, cherish real happiness. "Yes, Mom. You'll be happy too." "Thank you." Since then, it seems my ex-husband has not been seen at my husband's restaurant. After such a disgraceful display, it's unlikely he'll ever appear. I don't know what became of the two, but whether they're miserable or lonely, it doesn't concern me. Now, I only think about cherishing the most important